a good sign you're still clapping for me after those two last night. So welcome to lecture number 3, which I titled Communism 2.5 because I'm super creative. I really wanted to force the 1.0, 2.0, 3.0 model that I'm barely even talking about. So I was like, well, what do I do with Western Marxism? Well, that's 2.5. It's also in this 20th century time period. There are a lot of things that happened in the West, but the primary difference between what happened in the East, that being Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, and their satellites, the primary difference is that they were taking over in the East feudal societies and peasants who they could basically boss around, particularly at the end of the barrel of a gun, because they just weren't ready for what was coming to them, and they were promised bread and land or grain and land and a more equal society, and they were kind of in on it at the beginning. The peasants actually facilitated both revolts rather tremendously, but in the West, they were up against the capitalist culture and machine, which turned out to be strong and healthy and vibrant, at least to a pretty significant degree. So it wasn't as easy to just boss Westerners around. It wasn't as easy to effect a big military coup by rousing the population to turn on their governments. And so it had to develop in the West in a completely different direction, which, as I mentioned last night, is a subversive direction. So where you have this kind of top-down force going on in Eastern Marxism or industrial Marxism. Over here in Western Marxism, you have a very kind of infiltrating, subversive, frankly, whining, bitching, and complaining at the bottom sort of thing, which is a different mode in a different line of thinking. So this, I don't know that this represents a gigantic amount of the evolution of communist thought particularly, but it sets up the stage for the next leap, which is why I didn't want to make this be a 3.0 moving on into a different one, because Western Marxism until very recently didn't work. It was very effective at taking over universities. It was very effective at disaffecting youth, but it didn't succeed in producing a revolution. They attempted this in 1968 and it didn't work. The famous in France, the May 1968 riots. There were riots all over in 68 and 69 in the US that were fed by this, and it didn't take. That method wasn't going to work here. And really this is kind of this long unfolding story of frustrated Marxists. We could give it a million names, but there's a lot of things going on, so it gets really complicated. I'm going to just kind of call it Western Marxism for the moment, and that includes a lot of different things. Cultural Marxism, which is a no-no word. We're not allowed to say that. I'm now engaging in conspiracy theories, which we heard last night is Mao's bad element category. Critical Marxism, which a lot of people don't even use that term. They use the words critical theory, which hides the fact that it's actually critical Marxism, but I actually got it from a critical Marxist, that calling it critical Marxism is more accurate, and that's in a book, not somebody I was just talking to. Then what I call coming into the 70s and 80s identity Marxism. So this is your birth of things like critical race theory and later queer theory, feminism, kind of taking a very revolutionary angle. And this all kind of culminates together in woke Marxism. And so this Western Marxism evolves in our context into what I refer to more generally as American Maoism, or sometimes Maoism with American characteristics. So this is part of the reason why I wish that we had had time to do a full lecture on Mao, because Mao becomes the pivotal character with the toolkit that has to get imported to make it work. So in other words, that Eastern Marxism fails and fails and fails and fails in its industrial form, becomes this kind of brainwashing personal conversion model under Mao, and those techniques get imported to make the critical theory side, which wasn't doing anything successfully, make it work in the popular front. So this is going to be much more kind of that Gnostic vibe, that we know the real secret of society and you don't, than even the vanguard of the East had. The vanguard was very explicit. We have the advanced theory, we know more than you. These guys are basically, you don't really understand the society you live in, and sowing, like I said, that subversive element. But it existed, Western Marxism, like Eastern Marxism, existed to solve the problem that they determined that Marx was wrong. These, in our model of the evolution of communism, are evolutionary pressures put on Marxist theory in order to advance through the 20th century, now in a completely different context, this Western capitalist context instead of the Eastern feudal context. But basically, Marxism did not follow Marx's predictions of how it would unfold. The capitalist masses did not spontaneously organize. They did not undergo revolution. They wanted reforms instead of wanting to take over the means of production. And especially here in the capitalist West, where people not only had relatively decent lives, but improving conditions, especially as workers' reforms started to come into the picture. They were satisfying workers, and this was a major problem. Like I said, there's lots of threads here. I think that if we were to really spend all the time we need to talk about what was going on in the 20th century in Western Marxism, plus or minus a decade on each side, we would probably need 4 lectures, honestly. So we have cultural Marxism and critical Marxism, which I've already introduced. Critical Marxism is cultural Marxism that is turned completely negative. It no longer really tries to aspire to any positive socialist vision. It explicitly says at times we can't name the thing that we're trying to get to, but we know it's qualitatively different than what we have, so we're just going to be very critical of everything. But then there's feminism. Feminism was a gigantic Western phenomenon, and feminism's huge, right? There are 20-something, I think when we wrote Cynical Theories, and I don't know if this is accurate, if I even remember it correctly, I think Helen Pluckrose went and counted and found at least 26 distinct branches of feminism that you could name and describe, none of which agree with each other at all. And in fact, they all hate each other. It's almost like herding cat ladies. But the feminists are responsible for importing from France, not solely, but largely responsible for importing from France something that would have, I think, died on the French vine, to make a wine reference, which is postmodernism. Postmodernism was not popular in France. It was considered basically academic screwing off and showing off by a bunch of kind of weirdos. And the French weren't really interested in it. The rest of Europe wasn't interested in it. But by God, British and American feminists were interested in it because it allowed them to deconstruct gender, which they were so desperate to do. And so the feminists, that's not even controversial. Feminists get mad if you ever blame them for anything because, of course, like all Marxists, they're never wrong. But they don't even deny having imported postmodernism into primarily into the English departments of Ivy League universities, particularly Yale. Yale University basically imported postmodernism through its English departments, through feminist professors. It also actually, though, postmodernism actually came in through the post-colonial side of things as well. The biggest post-colonialist was Edward Said, who's listed as a Palestinian-American professor, and he was deep, deep into Foucault. The next most famous one is Gayatri Spivak, and her work is just thoroughly postmodern. The third most famous one is Homi Bhabha, and he is impenetrable. It's just postmodern gobbledygook about the colonial context. But then we have, like I said, cultural Maoism, which is kind of like critical theory 2.0. And really in the 60s, we're not going to get too into the details of this, but I think in the 60s you see a split of critical theory, and you have the Marcuse branch goes off into what I'm now calling cultural Maoism or American Maoism, and the Habermas branch goes off and still does dorky academic critical theory, and I don't know Habermas at all, so we're not going to talk much about Habermas because I haven't cared, because the Marcuse branch is the branch that matters, because that's the branch that's been sowing revolution in the US for the rest of the time. We also have, like I said, this evolving into identity Marxism. That's the path that we call it intersectionality. Intersectionality, I gave a talk about this at Northwestern University. It was pretty controversial. It caused a lot of trouble, where I said that intersectionality is American Maoism. And that, of course, has evolved when they finally adopted the moniker in the 2010s of woke, which I just think is woke Marxism, which technically has a real name, or a real, not scientific, one of the technical term for how they operate, which is called critical constructivist epistemology. But to understand how that got there, that's through critical education theory. There's a million threads here. And then I skipped this tangent that we're actually going to start with in a minute, which is Fabianism. And Fabianism is British socialism or English socialism, which Orwell famously called ingsoc. It's kind of present if you want to see it in George Orwell. I mean, this is his vision for them taking power. But also there's some pretty interesting H.G. Wells versus Lenin things you can read where they were basically fighting about whether the British method of socialism or the Soviet method of socialism is better. Basically what this works out to be in the Western Marxist content is a road to soft totalitarianism. It's not the hard totalitarianism we saw in the East, but it doesn't start off as totalitarian because it doesn't have any power. But the goal is to seize the means of cultural production out from under a society. And then as you gain power to that, make it more and more and more that you have to agree with them or else you're on the outs with society. In other words, they're going to criticize the existing hegemony of society, the existing values and norms, and then try to take control of the values and norms and make everybody play to their rules, which is why we're supposed to all affirm transgender now, for example, just as a very pointed surface. It's also why we're all supposed to say Black Lives Matter and do all of these other humiliating things that they tried to make us do. But this is soft totalitarianism. You're not going to find Mao. This is one of the criticisms I get. Well, if this is Marxism or Maoism, who's Mao for the West? No. This is made to feel like, and I say that very deliberately, made to feel like it's bottom up and inside out, not top down. But the Maos are a network of nonprofits and corporate leaders and government leaders who are feeding this into the bottom to make it feel like a bottom-up movement. It's very subversive. Instead of focusing on forcing the production of the new man, basically what you're going to do is agitate people into disbelieving in the old man. So then they're going to be in this state of what's called anomie. They don't know who they are. They're lost. They're confused about their identity, and they start searching for a new one that you've ready-made and provided for them. And you do this through presenting new values, which are going to be those theosophical transformational values, while subverting the old values. As a matter of fact, the new values are going to be twisted versions of the old values. We're going to take the idea of liberty and transform it into liberation. We're going to take the idea of freedom and make it freedom from responsibility. You get the gist. You're going to get the idea of caring for, the underdog, which is a kind of general Christian principle, and make it hold up the oppressed, or lift up the oppressed, or rescue the oppressed. And these guys take Marx's idea very seriously, though, that everything starts with criticism. In fact, Marx was famous for saying that his model was the ruthless criticism of all that exists. And he based that off of a line from the mouth of Satan, Mephistopheles, in Goethe's version of Faust, where Mephistopheles says in that play, which Goethe wrote, that all that exists deserves to perish. So everything in the world is rotten, everything deserves to fall away, everything needs to be destroyed. And so that was Marx's muse, by the way, was Mephistopheles in Goethe's version of Faust. So if you want to read Faust, I think it's really an interesting story. It's extraordinarily long. I went to read Faust a couple of years ago, and I think I put on Twitter, I'm going to read Faust. It's about time. It was Marx's muse. Oh my God, it's 780 pages long. So, I don't have time for this. But like I said, we're going to start with a tangent. There are all these threads. This is going to be a little bit of jumping around because there's so many threads. But we're going to start with Ingsoc. Ingsoc is the name of the totalitarian government in 1984, and that's what I'm referring to call the Fabian Society. So two-tier Keir Starmer in Britain is a Fabian socialist. The Fabian socialists are not new. In fact, most of the prime ministers in most of the British Commonwealth throughout almost all of history, Australia, Canada, and so on, have had Fabian ties if they weren't outright Fabians. I think it's true, somebody can fact check, it's either every or almost every prime minister of Australia has been connected to the Fabians. You would know the Fabians probably by their softer name that they frequently use in public, which is the Labour Party, which is a little bit scary when you realize how well they've been doing. Ingsoc, I-N-G-S-O-C, was an abbreviation, a creative abbreviation for English socialism. And changing the E to an I think, is really clever because it has that idea they're just barely hiding themselves. This is exactly the same English socialism that Engels criticized as not being able to get its act together. But their goal was very different. It was actually to very slowly infiltrate and subvert. This is when this model, I was going to tell you something I haven't told you yet. This is when George Bernard Shaw said, that's later. I've been reading my notes that you haven't read yet. They were going to infiltrate and take over from within, which should feel very familiar. You hear Klaus Schwab say, penetrate the cabinets. Well, that's a very English socialism method. Although that does have roots back to Lenin. Lenin said the best way to control the opposition is to control it yourself, or to become the opposition from the inside. So this infiltration conspiracy thing, pretending to be your enemy. There's an old saying, it's on Beautiful Trouble, their activist website, dress like a Republican so you can speak like an anarchist. And they do this a lot. And I would recommend to you that you consider that our side fighting back against this is much more infiltrated than you probably realize. There are probably a lot of actors who are dressing like Republicans so they can speak in ways that bring agitprop to our class, if you will, our political class. So what was Orwell writing in 1984? Orwell was most likely, nowhere does he ever explicitly say this. There are strong hints in his Road to Wigan Pier, but he nowhere explicitly said that this is what he was doing. But the best guess of what 1984 represents is characterizing the Fabian socialists spending a century to gain the power of Stalin. The Fabian Society was founded in 1884. Now, Orwell was tricky. He published 1984 in 1948, so he said that he just swapped the order of the number of the year. But as a matter of fact, it's very likely that he was imagining the Fabians operating slowly for a century. They have a symbol that's a tortoise or a turtle. I think it's a turtle, not a tortoise. And it says underneath it, when I strike hard. So you slowly infiltrate, and then all of a sudden it's like it came out of nowhere all at once everywhere. The British right now are all asking in the UK, how did this happen so fast? It's like, it didn't. It happened over 100 years, and they didn't tell you until they thought they had enough power with these last couple of recent big wins to reveal themselves. So when I strike hard. So they hide themselves and then hit as hard as they can all at once. But like I said, this is the model of incrementalist socialism. It's basically the long march through the institutions British style as opposed to Marxist style. And because of this difference, and we're focusing on communism and Marxism in particular, that's why this is a kind of tangent. Their goals are political, cultural, and corporate capture from within. Those are their main agendas. Infiltrate the boards, infiltrate the committees, infiltrate the governments. They use education as much as they can as a route. So the most famous educational institution they founded is called the London School of Economics. If you go there, there's a gigantic globe outside on the campus that is upside down. So turn the world upside down is the imagery. The big players, the big characters, there are more, but I'm going to name George Bernard Shaw, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and Annie Besant, but there were lots more. This isn't a big Fabian lecture, and I'm actually not qualified to give a deep Fabian lecture. There are people in the room who are, so I'm not going to embarrass myself that way. There's a symbol that they have also at the London School of Economics, which by absolutely dumb luck, the whole team here and I had the good luck to see with our own eyes last, I guess, October. We walked over to the London School of Economics. Mike, who's doing the sound and speaking, the voice in the back, has had this vision of seeing the Fabian window, which is a stained glass window that they had made of themselves for years and years. It's in the George Bernard Shaw Library at the London School of Economics. They don't let people in for whatever set of reasons. So we show up, we're all dressed up, and it turns out that there was a funeral in the room. So we're dressed up and we say, can we go up to the George Bernard Shaw Library? And they say, are you on the list? And we say, what list? And the guy doesn't, being very British, doesn't want to say we can't go to the funeral. So he says, oh, just put your names on the list and go on up. So we put our names on the list. We went on up, we crash a funeral, we see the Fabian window. There it is, it's real. It's really fun. So we actually did see it, but the idea is it shows George Bernard Shaw and I think Sidney Webb with hammers and an anvil between them, and on the anvil is the earth heated to red hot, and they're beating it, while the other Fabians are working the bellows, which would be similar to the British version of Lenin's agitprop, to heat the world up, smash it to bits, and it says across the top, remold it nearer thine heart's desire. So they're going to heat the world up, which I think we're experiencing right now. Look at Britain under Ingsoc now. Look at the heat. And then they're going to smash it to pieces, and then they're going to put it back together the way they want. In other words, they have predetermined solutions for the crises that they're stimulating. And it's actually, there's a stained glass window commemorating that that's their vision. It turns out that George Bernard Shaw, his play My Fair Lady was originally titled Pygmalion. We talked about the Pygmalion myth last night. Turns out that's exactly the same thing. You're going to see if we can take a street rat and convince people she is what she isn't. And it's actually and if she is, then she gets to, basically the gentlemen win the bet, and maybe she gets to pretend she's a noble for the rest of her life. Now, these guys at the Fabians rejected violent revolution, so they're not Marxist. They're still communist. Actually, you'll hear George Bernard Shaw in a second say that he's a flaming hot communist. But they did not like the idea of violent revolution. This is all subversive, which is why it fits into this besides being Western. So this is a difference of methods, but not beliefs. As far as the underlying religious beliefs of transforming the world, we just heard the Fabian window actually portrays that. And imagine making a stained glass window, which is kind of, we associate this with churches, to commemorate that that's your view of the world. On that window, by the way, I think I have it in here somewhere else, but I want to just point out they have their coat of arms. The coat of arms for the Fabian Society is literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. It is literally that. You can look it up yourself whenever you want. It is literally, go to your search engine, type in coat of arms Fabians, and you're going to see a wolf in sheep's clothing on a shield. So this is a difference of methods, like I said, but not of beliefs. Here's George Bernard Shaw saying exactly that. He says, until you have socialism, you will never have state solidity, because as we know, if you have private property, you will immediately split your stake. So there it is. He's against private property. He said, you will get the class conflict, the class struggle, the confrontation of interests between the proprietors and between the proletariat. And therefore, you have something that is crumbling, that is divided against itself. And then he added, as a red-hot communist, I am in favor of fascism. The only drawback to Sir Oswald Mosley's movement is that it's not quite British enough. I really encourage you to look up some videos of the things George Bernard Shaw said, so you can hear it in his squeaky little oily, smiley voice. Turns out this Oswald Mosley was a British aristocrat who was a socialist and funded a lot of socialist activities and got pissed off that it wasn't going fast enough, it wasn't working, so he became a fascist in the early 1930s. And so what's Ingsoc? What is English socialism? It's communism with British intelligence characteristics is what it is. And it operates through infiltration to set up a liberal conservative dialectic in the cabinets. In other words, a uniparty. We call them rhinos, or we used to. We call them NatCon now. That's a very controversial statement. But it's Klaus Schwab's penetrate the cabinets method, which is, like I said, has links to Lenin, but it's very British and slick and polite and kindly. So here's the sickly kindliness. And I really, really hope you'll look this video up. You can watch this. We'll definitely have to throw this in when we put this together, of George Bernard Shaw actually saying a very sickly, kindly, very communist thing. And it's really great in his oily little voice. So you'll get what you need to search to find it. It's very easy to find.
I don't want to punish anybody, but there are an extraordinary number of people whom I want to kill. Not in any unkind or personal spirit, but it must be evident to all of you. You must all know half a dozen people at least who are no use in this world, who are more trouble than they are worth. I think it would be a good thing to make everybody come before a properly appointed board, just as he might come before the income tax commissioners, and say every 5 years or every 7 years, just put him there and say, sir or madam, now will you be kind enough to justify your existence? If you can't justify your existence, if you're not pulling your weight in the social boat, if you're not producing as much as you consume, or perhaps a little more, then clearly, we cannot use the big organization of our society for the purpose of keeping you alive, because your life does not benefit us, and it can't be of very much use to yourself.
So you thought, like, My Fair Lady was cute. It's not cute. This dude's a demon. Kindly, gentle, I don't want to hurt anybody. And he does talk where he talks about killing everybody or whatever that's of no use. Oh, we'll just put them in a nice chamber with nice gas that puts them to sleep and they just never wake up. No pain, no punishment. But you have to justify your existence before an Obama death panel every 5 to 7 years, apparently. He also was a big fan, like I said, of the fascism. So he's really just a kindly, gentle, more saccharine Stalin. This George Bernard Shaw. This is why I think Orwell had that fantasy of IngSoc, English socialism, gaining the power of Stalin and characterize it as big brother. So here's another George Bernard Shaw quote. Hitler is a very remarkable man, a very able man. What Hitler should have done, so this English, kindly, gentle, what he should have done was not to drive the Jews out. What he ought to have said was, I will tolerate the Jews to any extent on condition that no Jew marries a Jewess, on condition that he marries a German. So you think that this guy might be a eugenicist. He was, big time. So it's this weird halfway, as we would say, exoteric on the outside, but also halfway esoteric. He's going to obliterate the Jewish religion, which has matrilineal lineage, by making sure that no Jewish male marries a Jewish woman. They all have to marry Germans. So you're going to breed the Jews out of Germany, was what he said Hitler should have done. Which means he never really read Mein Kampf, because he has this whole chapter of his race ideology that he got from Helena Blavatsky that says straight up that the mixing of blood actually waters it down, and that's why you can't do it. So he probably didn't read as Hitler, but he's got his kindly British way. And he's very polite and very cheerful, and he's always kind of bobbling. He looks like a living bobblehead, actually, with a nice little beard. And he sounds very polite and very friendly, and he's saying the most hideous things you can possibly imagine. But you start to get this idea then of there's an opt-in tyranny. You know, I'll tolerate Jews as long as they do what I say, which is this actually extremely tyrannical thing. And if you don't want to, well, that's too bad. There's a death panel. Or we'll drive you out, right? So it's opt-in, or your life is going to be terrible or maybe bluntly ended. And you start to get this seed of the opt-in tyranny. I keep driving opt-in tyranny because we're going to talk about that this afternoon, and it's key to how everything works now. Fabian socialism operates on a model called the open conspiracy. Why? Because if the conspiracies are supposed to be secret. So if you just tell everybody out in the open what you're doing, people say, well, they can't mean that. They wouldn't tell us if that's what they're really doing. So they just tell you literally everything they're doing. You should see maybe The Shape of Things to Come by H.G. Wells. You should maybe look into what the Fabians wrote and say what they're going to do. They tell you extraordinarily explicitly what they're going to do. They don't hide it, because if it's out in the open, they think nobody will believe it. And guess what? Nobody does. So this is actually a throwback to those secret societies that Babeuf and Weishaupt were members of, but now you're not going to hide the conspiracy, you're going to hide the conspiracy in plain sight. This enables what are sometimes called open communications, where they can tell their followers exactly what the next thing to do is. I would suggest that the way that Keir Starmer is speaking in Britain right now is likely a lot of it is open communications. He's giving a veiled indication to the gangs of thugs that they won't be prosecuted, but the people who stand up to them will. And that's called an open communication. They're openly telling you what's coming, but only the people who get it. Now, Orwell characterized the power of the Fabians through Big Brother. Of course, right now, the UK is trying to even flirt with the idea of extraditing Americans who say things that inflame passions against Fabian interests in Britain, and extradite Americans for things they post on social media and arrest them in the UK. Like, I'm not getting on the plane. Like, but imagine living in the UK. I mean, the memes are great right now. They're showing a bunch of like Cheka and Stasi characters from movies or whatever, and it says, do you have a meme underneath your floorboards? But what Big Brother represents is not just a totalized surveillance state, but one that you're meant to love, one that you're meant to appreciate, one that's doing it for your own good and you know it. The very George Bernard Shaw character. So it's a kindly, gentle, opt-in version of Stalin's power that's characterized in Big Brother. And really, the Big Brother model, the screens and everything in 1984, are used to contour beliefs of the people to increasingly get on the party line, or in other words, to increasingly adopt the theosophical socialist model. This is like what Mao did, but high tech, which gives you queasy vibes about what's going on in the world right now. Of course, they've got the cameras everywhere. They said that they have an entire police force dedicated to monitoring social media for incorrect posts. They're arresting people for memes and posts in Britain right now. So imagine what the kind of snitch state that you had under Mao might look like if you had the technology of today. And that's what I want to say is being coordinated not just by the British government, but particularly by the World Economic Forum and the United Nations. The World Economic Forum connects the governments to the businesses with nonprofit backing so that they will project into the future that which would be profitable to build by figuring out what the plan is and then rigging the regulatory environment so that that's what the corporations want to build and that's where the big profit centers are going to be. And also contouring the ESG scoring that's going to make sure that that in the short term is profitable until the scam comes to pass. Another big theme in 1984, and it's the only way to really talk about the Fabians. It's like we can just skip the Fabians and just talk about 1984 because Orwell already did it for us, is that Oceania, that's the big kind of Western world government. There's 3 governments in the world there. Oceania has always been at war with East Asia, and kind of the joke is that it was that Oceania has always been at war with Eurasia, and then it switches to East Asia, but it was always been, right? So there are these 3 regions, which are Oceania, which is basically Western Europe and North America, and then there's Eurasia, which is roughly Russia, and then you have East Asia, which might be the eastern part of Russia, I don't know, but China and all of that, you could imagine as global regions. He's not too specific as where they are, but you're always at war with them. So you always have this external enemy, which is why you have to have so much unity within, and it gives you a focused concentration for your 2 minutes hate, which is partly criticism of the external enemy and the other ways of life in the world that you're at war with, but also self-criticism for how you're not living up to the Big Brother standard, the socialist standard, which is extremely Maoist actually in its flavor, which Orwell would not have known what Mao was doing because Mao hadn't even done it yet, writing in 1948 when Mao took power in 1949. But the idea is that we have the same system being implemented in 3 different regions, so there's a dialectical pseudo-conflict between the regions that motivates the populations to all get in line to fight the so-called external enemy. And the long-term goal is actually that those systems, because they're all the same, eventually could merge when you kind of work out the tension and get the people firmly enough on board that they don't need an external enemy to hate each other, or to hate outside of themselves, I say, so they would unify inside. And so here we could say our Western alliance has always been at war with Eastern communism. The Chinese system today would be East Asia, maybe the Russia-Soviet satellites would be Eurasia, and it switches who we're at war with, but then you look at BRICS where those 2 have become an alliance, and you have the Western alliance versus the BRICS alliance, and you're like, uh-oh, 2 systems, same model, what's going on? We're not really going to talk much more about the Fabians because I want to talk about Western Marxism particularly, and these aren't Marxists, but they are communists. But I encourage you, if you're interested, to read Carroll Quigley. I will, just admit to you, I have not. I've kind of cursory looked at some of the things that he's written. I'd encourage you to read a book called The Milner-Fabian Conspiracy. If you want to see just how out there it is, and you will see what's happening in the UK is written quite explicitly, I'm told there. I want to also indicate that the Fabians were instrumental in bringing the Frankfurt School of Western Marxism to America, probably with money from the big foundations like the Rockefellers. I don't know the details and don't want to accuse things that are not completely nailed down here, but just to say that they were instrumental in bringing the Frankfurt School or the critical Marxists here. And then they were also tied up with Helena Blavatsky's Theosophical Society through Annie Besant, who was one of their founding members. So you have the same exact theosophical religion present, and now it's developing in a British context, in a British way, instead of in a Marxist way, or this hippy-dippy, silly Robert Mueller UN way. Like I said earlier, the Fabians run the governments in significant ways in most of the Commonwealth countries. They have infiltrated the conservative parties as well as the left parties. They are heavily infiltrated in American politics as well. I won't name any names right now, but they are on both sides. So Fabianism has been woven into and through everything that we're going to say for the rest of this lecture, and can't really be fully ignored. So I'm going to reference Ingsoc a lot, and when I do, this is what I'm talking about. I'm not just making a cute 1984 reference. So people that see clips on the internet won't know that. You're now my Gnostic disciples. All right, so we have to go back in time from where we left off last time. We were talking about the 1950s and the 1960s, actually, maybe even if we talk till Mao's death, 1976, in the last lecture, and we're going to have to go back to the World War I era here to talk about cultural Marxism, developing into critical Marxism, developing eventually into woke Marxism, which is a mixture. Woke is, I'm not going to actually say a lot about woke. It's just a blend of all of the other pieces that we're talking about. Critical theory or critical Marxism, Maoism, postmodernism, critical education, and liberation theology, and American Mao. Like all these things are just mixed together, and we get this witch's brew that's kind of woke, which is very religious in its nature. People are mostly, in fact, it's almost not to be glib, but it's almost a charismatic religion. It's almost most of the people who are woke feel woke. They don't know what woke is. They don't know woke. They feel woke. Their friends are woke. Their clubs are woke. Everything that they think is good and fun in life is woke. And of course, they're constantly miserable as a result. But it's a very idealistic and religious movement that's very personal. It's like a personal relationship with socialism that manifests in your specific corner of life, however small it is, which is why you have thousands of identities cut into the smallest possible granular features that still reflect the communist ideal, because it's now a personal relationship with socialism, if you want to put it that way. That's what woke becomes. And there's a ton to this story, like I've already indicated. And we're going to try to get through all of it, sort of. So we had a problem back in World War I, for Marxists had a problem, I should say, outside of Russia. We know what the thing was going on in Russia, but the Marxists in Europe in particular were at a complete loss. During World War I, there were socialists, but there were no Marxists. There was no CPUSA, I should say. CPUSA was founded after the Bolshevik Revolution, so there was none of that in the United States yet. But there were a lot of Marxists in Europe who were trying to figure out what was going on, and it was that Marx's vision isn't working out anywhere. So imagine you've got your religious prophet, and he had this perfect vision for how everything's supposed to go, and you've been banging at it for decades, and it didn't go, right? And they're very frustrated. The only success story by the end of World War I that you have anywhere in the world for communism is Lenin, which bucks the theory. The theory said that it's supposed to be capitalist society, spontaneously organized, and you have a vanguard party taking over a feudal society. That's wrong. Marx missed something. None of the Western capitalist countries would organize. The workers wouldn't spontaneously organize. The workers didn't want to have revolutions. The workers turned, especially during the war, to their nationalist identities and to fascism, as a matter of fact, in response to war and the creeping threat of communist expansion. The workers wanted labor reforms, and they didn't want anything but kind of improvements in their lives and the opportunity to build a better life for themselves. They didn't want to flip society upside down and lose it. Industrial capitalist societies or economies were increasingly working well. And this is what Lenin and Stalin constantly denounced as opportunism. And they smashed that in the East, but it was too prevalent in the West already to simply come in and smash. It wasn't peasants trying to set up the ability to make businesses and grow their opportunities. It was that those opportunities and businesses already existed. It's a completely different circumstance. So what they're looking at is that communism against Marxist theories only seems to work when you force it on a feudal state through a vanguard party, which won't even work where they are in the West. But they want Marxism because they're religious Marxists, and obviously it's supposed to take over the whole world because it's the scientific truth of reality as they believe it, or that it's their religious belief, actually. In other words, they needed the West to somehow reimagine what could be unburdened by what has been, and they didn't know how to do it. So we have some major characters: Antonio Gramsci, the Albanian Italian. I used to just say he was Italian, but the Italians got upset with me and said, point out that he's Albanian. And I was like, okay. He's usually considered the father of cultural Marxism, which we're not allowed to talk about. But there's an obligatory reminder here that Antonio Gramsci was translated into English by Joseph Buttigieg, which is a very unique last name, at Notre Dame in 1970. And so Mayor Secretary Pete is a red diaper baby. There's another character that's less well known than Antonio Gramsci, that's George Lukács, and he's Hungarian. He's actually probably the real father of cultural Marxism. He was much more prolific, which is to say something, and actually not in prison, which helped him, disseminate his work. He was also the deputy commissar of education in the Hungarian Soviet regime while it lasted. So he had a position of power in a Soviet satellite. And he wrote prolifically from the 1920s until the 1950s. And by communist standards, he's actually a fairly lucid writer. Gramsci's writings were locked away in a prison and then in a vault in Moscow until the 60s or 70s. And he's a rambler. He is literally just rambling for thousands of pages. And then we have a big character in this cultural to critical Marxism pipeline named Max Horkheimer, we're going to talk about. He was obviously German, and he was not the founder of the Frankfurt School, but was its first truly effective leader. I forgot what word I'm looking for, but I'll come back to it. So he is the creator of the critical theory. Max Horkheimer invented critical theory and therefore really organized the critical Marxism out of cultural Marxism. So he is the kind of mutation spot in the line of thinking in Western Marxism there for our evolution motif. Now we have to do an annoying thing, which is a note on the terminology of cultural Marxism. Western Marxism is the safe umbrella term to use. A lot of conservatives are running around saying it's cultural Marxism, and then they get accused of being a conspiracy theorist. Look at my Wikipedia, look at my Southern Poverty Law Center hate profile. They tell you that I traffic in the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, which is allegedly anti-Semitic. So cultural Marxism is a difficult term to use. Western Marxism is the safe term, and it encompasses all of the things that we're talking about here. Cultural Marxism, though, can sort of be rescued, not against the PSYOPs, but it can be rescued. Because it refers specifically to the early 20th century attempts to bring Marxist critique into elements of Western and capitalist culture to subvert them from within. And it was a conspiracy, sort of, but an open one, but it's not really a conspiracy theory. I will point out, if you look at Wikipedia and you type in cultural Marxism on Wikipedia, it takes you to a page titled Cultural Marxism Conspiracy Theory. And then you can link in the little text below to the actual page that describes cultural Marxism as a movement, which was the page that was there back in 2020. And then I think I started talking about it publicly very accurately, and all of a sudden it became a conspiracy theory on Wikipedia. I didn't say this on camera, did I? But that Robert Malone told me that it's likely that Wikipedia is curated by the CIA, at least for these controversial things. So you can guess why that got rewritten. It's not just dorks on the internet trying to cover things up. It's a deliberate operation of misinformation and disinformation and malinformation, which is of course what we're not supposed to traffic in. So Western Marxism is really the umbrella term. A lot of people use cultural Marxism as the umbrella term, but it's fraught because there's a giant psyops to make you look like a bad element, as Mao would call you, for talking about cultural Marxism. But it started in the 1910s. And it blossomed in the 1920s and 30s, and it evolved into critical Marxism by the late 1930s going into the 1940s, and otherwise kind of fell out of fashion. Critical Marxism refers to the application of critical theory, which was developed by the Frankfurt School, Max Horkheimer specifically, in 1937. So after that, we have this full evolution in the cultural Marxism line, or the Western Marxist line. We'll talk about postmodernism in this lecture, by the way, as well. This is the 1960s, really, 70s, 80s phenomenon. It kind of dies out in the 1990s in its pure form. It is labeled as a post-Marxist theory. In other words, they gave up on Marxism. No, I'm going to just say that that's not right. But we live in post-modernity because of the work of these people, and if you don't like the crazy topsy-turvy world of post-modernity, A, you can thank mass media and social media, but B, you can thank a feminist for importing it. We're going to have to talk about critical education theory, which is imported actually from these third world anti-imperialist satellites. In particular, it was developed first in Brazil and across South America as the Marxist Paulo Freire got exiled from one South American country after another, only to end up in Geneva, protected for a long time, flitting back and forth to New York and Boston and working with Harvard University and others in the meantime. I'm not going to get into the big details of that yet. We have identity Marxism, woke Marxism, all coming up. Good times. So cultural Marxism, now that we've pulled back the veil on terminology, we're just going to rock and roll with it. The key concept here, articulated by Antonio Gramsci, is cultural hegemony. We already have this idea of hegemony in society, that it's the force of, it's kind of how it is what it sort of means, just as a generic way to describe it, or a simple way to describe it. And so like a government hegemony is kind of very easy to understand. Definitely there was a hegemony being enforced by Lenin and Stalin and the Soviet Union. Well, here's cultural hegemony. There's no necessary hegemon. There's no leader who's saying this is how it's going to be anywhere in the West, at least not in capitalist countries, but everybody seems to go along with the same norms and values. So that's a cultural force of how it is, so to speak. And so Lenin was trying to discipline this from the outside, and what they noticed is that capitalist societies had too much of their own to accept that direct route. And so the goal for Gramsci was to infiltrate and create counter-hegemony within the cultural producing institutions. The 5 cultural producing institutions that he named as particular targets are family, religion, education, media, and law, with a particular emphasis on education, because the others are largely downstream from that, with the exception of family. But you could also drive wedges into the family by capturing education and getting the kids to turn on their parents or their culture. And so the idea was to infiltrate the institutions in the broad sense, not necessarily like, a specific, the American Medical Association institution, but the broad sense, family as an institution, marriage as an institution, religion in general, not specifically, say, the Southern Baptist Convention or some church. You're going to transform those from within by bringing subverted versions of their own values to them that predispose them to shifting to a socialist worldview over the course of a long time, generations actually. And the way that this was supposed to happen, according to Gramsci, was through characters called organic intellectuals. So we're not going to have the vanguard, who are the enlightened theorists who are going to be the leaders. We're going to have organic intellectuals. We're basically going to be working class people who live and suffer the tumults of their lives in the working class exploitative environment, but are also being fed enough Marxist theory to become cadres or leaders or community organizers. And so I think the word that we would use in the modern parlance for organic intellectuals is community organizers. So you see these huge protest events that the left does. We've watched a lot of them again this year, and you wonder, some of these are very obviously losing battles for them. Why in the world are they taking the hit? This is recruitment and training for leaders, for organic intellectuals. You get people to show up, you find out who naturally takes leadership roles, then you offer them a position to come get trained to be a proper community organizer, because you figure out who are the ones who are naturally filling a leadership role. So they use protests like we've been watching over the course of the last year, these huge pro-Hamas protests, for example. You say, why in the world are they doing that? They're recruiting. They're recruiting, finding future leaders, and training them to be community organizers, so organic intellectuals. And these people work like the vanguard, but it's also a diffuse, it's not a specific, it's networked actually, but it's not like highly organized and disciplined like the Soviet vanguard was. So that's why it's organic. So this is a reconfiguration of Lenin's schema from top-down power to what we would call inside-out power. You're going to work inside the institutions and society itself and transform it from the inside out to new values. So homegrown, which is in reality to say astroturfed or paid for terrorists instead of state terrorists, are the people that are going to go around and drive communism in the West. This, of course, parallels the liberationist approaches where you just go into the South American or whatever countries and you work the people up and let them have a revolution on their own terms, which was a Lenin project of anti-imperialism, instead of just trying to force the Marx-Engels brew directly on people like the vanguard in Russia did. And the idea was that the organic or intellectuals would rise up by combining theory with their lived experience of oppression, and thus they are effectively the precursor to culturally relevant education and to the entire woke movement. That's why it isn't technically wrong to call what's happening broadly cultural Marxism. I'm just telling you that if you do, they're going to say you're a conspiracy theorist and a bad element, and if you use Western Marxism instead, they're on their heels, and they haven't figured out how that's a conspiracy theory yet, but they will, and then that makes them look like fools, because there's a lot of literature out there talking very specifically about these things. It's easy to cite and show that they're doing manipulation. So what this really is, though, is that they're trying to figure out an organic way to build what were called the workers' councils, if we say it in English, in the Soviet Union, and to make them an integral part of society, all through society, in their organic contexts that they're going to rise up in, rather than being party functionaries specifically. Now, I didn't tell you the Russian word, and my Russian pronunciation is never good, but the Russian word for workers' councils is Soviet. And so they're building an organic Soviet within the population to transform it from within. That's cultural Marxism. So Gramsci named Western culture as an increasingly world hegemonic problem that was in needs of dismantling very quickly before basically capitalist culture took over the world, so that we could liberate the world from its grasp. His idea was basically that Marxism is apparently flawed, but that's okay because it's pointed in the right direction. In kind of Maoist terms, we would say that it's right on 9 fingers, but wrong on 1. So there's going to be some critique of Marx, but it's going to proceed in the same Marxist vein. And what that allows them to do as a nasty trick is to say, we're not Marxists, we criticize Marx. And then everybody's confused. The current this movement we're dealing with can't be Marxist. They criticize Marx. The postmodernists criticize Marx. The critical theorists criticize Marx. They're not Marxists. They're something different. They're neo-Marxists. Whatever. Right? This just confuses the language, and we can't name what's really going on. The point of this workshop is to cut through all that BS and say, this is Marxism as it has evolved and transformed through time in order to be able to take over our present society. So here's what Gramsci says about this. I'm not going to quote Gramsci very much. Turns out the prison notebooks were 3,000 pages long, or more than, actually. He says, and you'll get this feel of this rambly writing. He says, it's not important that this movement had its origins in mediocre philosophical works. Or at best in works that were not philosophical masterpieces. So there's a little shade for you, Marx. What matters is that a new way of conceiving the world and man is born. So there's your theosophy, there's your religion of Marxism. And that this conception is no longer reserved to the great intellectuals, to professional philosophers, but tends rather to become a popular mass phenomenon with a concrete worldwide character capable of modifying, even if the result includes hybrid combinations, popular thought and mummified popular culture. So we're going to allow hybrid combinations of other models of thinking. We're going to go into the context. We're going to use organic intellectuals to create a new inside-out movement rather than a top-down movement. So the theosophical root is still present. The methods have changed from top-down to inside-out, and we're still working on, like it said, what matters is a new way of conceiving the world and man is born. In other words, we're still working on seeing what can be unburdened by what has been. Gramsci's idea, his praxis, was to infiltrate the cultural producing institutions and bring socialism into them from the inside. And it turns out they weren't very good at that at first. That was to build out what I said is called a counter-hegemonic view within the institutions that are now producing softness to socialism. The modern word, we don't use counter-hegemonic very often in our discourse today. We call it diverse. Diversity means counter-hegemonic. It means outside of the prevailing value set, diverse to the value set of the West. Think of who they count as diverse when they're not doing the token game. Think of tokens and revolutionaries, right? Just like with Mao. The tokens have identities like skin color or sexual orientation. The revolutionaries, however, are what they're really after. And what are the revolutionaries? The revolutionaries are people who have values that are inimical to Western values. They can be communist or socialist, obviously. They also can be radical Islam, for example. Anybody who hates America is diverse. And that's what it actually means. And the goal is to manipulate all of that, to break apart the existing cultural values, to open the door for socialism to come through. Now, I will tell you, of course, the radical Islamists or the Muslims have a very different idea of what's going to come through the broken door. And historically speaking, the communists have not done very well against them anywhere except in the Uyghur region of China, which already had a dictatorship set up to deal with that. You can look at Iran. Iran made a deal with the communists in order to break their liberal government in the 70s. Do you see any communists in Iran now? They were told convert or die once the Ayatollah took over. Gramsci theorized a lot. That's all the Gramsci we're going to talk about, but he theorized a lot. I just want to give you a flavor. But most importantly, he theorized through the 1910s and 1920s before he went to prison. That's very important. The bulk of his work was done in prison in what's published as the Prison Notebooks. It's over 3,000 pages. That's what Joseph Buttigieg translated. And he wrote that in prison after the Italian fascists locked him up in 1926, and I quote, to stop his brain from working for 20 years. So he went to prison, secretly wrote over 3,000 pages of Marxist theory, so I don't think they stopped his brain from working, they just took him out of society. There's some kind of a lesson hidden there somewhere. Those notebooks were immediately smuggled out of the prison and to Moscow upon his death. So fascism, with all of its ability to smash communism, couldn't even stop the prison notebooks from being written in their prison or from being smuggled out to Moscow by the same year that he died. And so they were kept in the Soviet vaults. I don't know if they were translated into Russian or used. I would imagine they were. I don't know. This is a huge gap, not just in my knowledge, but I spent like weeks looking into this a couple of years ago because I wanted to find out if Mao knew what Gramsci wrote. And I cannot find any significant evidence that he knew what was in the prison notebooks. But his work before he went to prison was well known. And in particular, his work before he went to prison wasn't just well known. Gramsci shared letters routinely with Lenin. Gramsci warned him about Stalin. Gramsci, which didn't ingratiate him with Stalin very much. And Gramsci networked and went to meetings, even though his health was very poor, with the founders of the Frankfurt School. George Lukács and Antonio Gramsci networked with the founders of the Frankfurt School, and they shared ideas constantly. So the cultural and critical Marxist milieu were really kind of a crossover. But over in Hungary, at the same time, and a little bit after, as you have Antonio Gramsci writing, you have George Lukács. And his most famous work is History and Class Consciousness, which he wrote in 1923. I find that to be a very difficult but very lucid read, although I certainly will not understand it the first 7 times you read it. But the key concepts that we're going to pull out of that are social reification and the educability of class consciousness. Educability is a big fancy word that means you can teach it. So you can teach people to have class consciousness. You don't just go kind of rant at them about Marxist stuff while they have shitty jobs. Whoops, I swore in a conference. You don't just go rant at them about Marxism while they have shitty jobs and convince them to become Marxists. You can actually teach them to become Marxists, step by step, in a graduated process. Here's a little bit more, here's a little bit more. But then also social reification, how you can use social pressure to make things become real. Of course, he was doing it as a critique. He was saying the capitalists use social pressure to make false things become real and imbue false consciousness on the society that prevents them from adopting a class consciousness that would allow them to become revolutionaries. So social reification is an extremely important concept in our lives today. They try to force you to agree with woke through what I say is opt-in tyranny, because your life will suck if you don't participate. But woke becomes true when people believe that woke is true. And so they try to force you to act like woke is true. And if you don't agree that woke is true, that's fine, keep your mouth shut, or we're going to make your life miserable. We'll get you fired. Cancel culture is the example of that. We'll hound you. We'll get your kids to stop talking to you, whatever it happens to be. We're going to split families up. We're going to make this the most divisive. You can't even be around your awful uncle who spouts off Fox News politics at dinner. Literally. So if we all act like woke is true, then woke is true because it's socially made real. Reification means making real. So when society believes something is real or believes something is true, then it is. That's the idea of reification. So the technical definition is social relations are attached to the object of those relations and considered real parts of them. So transgender is real when people believe in it, for example, which is why your participation, unlike transsexualism, by the way, transsexuals are people who are dealing with their mental illness in a particular way, but your participation is not necessarily required. Transgender, you better affirm them or they're going to kill themselves or something that's not even true. They're going to throw a giant fit. We all have to go along with it. And there's an extortion racket, in other words, attached to this, and a pressure and coercion campaign. You're certainly going to get censored off of social media. It's actually illegal to call drag queens performing in front of children groomers in Canada. That's considered hate speech. You can be arrested or fined for it. So everybody has to affirm the ideology in order to reify it or make it true. Another one that's more to Lukács's point, would be the economic reality is capitalist, that we're actually competitive and that the economy flourishes when we each have our own and try to make the best we can with our own, according maybe to Jesus' parable of the talents or something. But Lukács would say that's only because people believe it, because the capitalists have put out the ideology of capitalism to make people believe that's how it really is. And so everybody's mystified into believing that that's reality when there's a different economic reality that's out there that they're now blind to. And so their idea then, the cultural Marxist idea then, is that they've got to seize the means of the production of social reification. They have to be able to convince or brainwash people to believe the socialist thing, and then they'll make socialism become real. Rather than forcing it till people become it, now we're going to get people to believe it until more people believe it, until it becomes how it is. Actually, it turns out that what we're going to talk about George Soros some later today, George Soros's dialectical method that he calls reflexivity actually generates very actionable social reification campaigns, effectively through certain types of agitprop. So we'll talk about how relevant that is with a very famous name at the end of the next lecture. This introduces not just an inside-out component, but a bottom-up component. So you've got top-down, bottom-up, and inside-out are three different ways that you could push power to make a change. And now we've talked about top-down in the East, but now we have this bottom-up and we have this inside-out aspects that are coming up. But the bottom-up is fake. It's influenced by the agitprop of the party and of the organic intellectuals going and sowing discontent and getting people. It's not an organic or naturally emergent movement. It's not just a result of miseducation, though in generational speak it becomes that. But the goal is to make it so that whatever the people believe is actually true.
Is that using the mass line?
Mass lines are a way of making that happen. So yes, it is related to the mass line for sure. So in terms of the communist religion, this means taking control of the reality-making components of your perceptions. In other words, we're now going to be able to make you see what can be, unburdened by what has been, but mostly in quiet, subversive, non-forceful ways. We're just going to convince you this is a better way of living and get you to adopt new values. Now, class consciousness, we all kind of have that awareness of what Marx said. You've got the classes that are intrinsically opposed. The reason there's no revolution is that the underclass it's too consumed with its own competition and survival to realize that it's a class that has the power to make history and transform things. So you have to wake up a class consciousness so the proletariat thinks of itself as a giant human colossus with massive amounts of popular force because they're a giant majority versus a tiny minority. That's the theory, at least. But like I said, they're trying to solve this problem that the workers don't want this. They're not actually interested. They want reforms. They don't mind if they learn some useful tactics, but they want reforms. They don't want a revolution. They basically just want basic concessions and a better opportunity to make from their own, and maybe the hope, the American dream of becoming the boss themselves if they work hard one day. And they prefer their national, religious, and family identities to class identities in the West. So class consciousness, Lukács explains in the third chapter of this book in particular, can be taught in stages by revealing slowly in pieces Marxist reality. This is what Kamala Harris calls the root causes, right? It's not that you suffer because your job is hard or because things aren't perfect. It's that there's actually, you suffer. Why is the border open? We'll use Kamala Harris as exactly. There's a root cause. And that root cause is that the North, the West, America has created misery for people all over the world, and all these wars are raging, and there's climate change, so all these poor people have to come across the border. So when she says we're going to get to the root causes, that's coded language. People who don't know, people low information or low engagement, will hear that and think, oh, she's going to get to the real bottom of it. We're not just going to put a wall and pretend it solves the problem. We're going to get to the bottom of why this is happening. But her answers for why it's happening are climate change, decades of colonial abuse by the West, and so we're going to solve the root causes, in other words, by injecting more Marxist theory. So if anybody's curious about whether Madam Vice President is a communist, the answer is certainly yes. And this, of course, meshes with the organic intellectual idea. We're going to get the organic intellectuals to work with their friends and neighbors in their organic contexts to teach them the class consciousness. So the first part of teaching class consciousness is, hey, you're a member of a class, and society's actually split into oppressor versus oppressed. It's stratified by class. And you're a member of one of these classes. And you have something to do because you're a member of one of these classes. Maybe you're the liberal white women crying on a Zoom video, so you have to atone and use your privilege to transform the world and be an ally. Or maybe you're an oppressed minority, so you need to become an activist and change the world. But you have to first have solidarity with all the other oppressed people. But you're a member of a class, and society is broken into these classes that are intrinsically in conflict. Secondly, you teach people that I've actually kind of given you most of the picture there, but secondly, you teach that you have common cause with your class. All the oppressed people in the world, all oppression is basically manifestations of one oppression. So everybody in the underclass is in the underclass, and you have common cause with them. And if you're in the overclass, the oppressor class, you really should think better and have better values and help the people down below and get yourself some virtue signaling points. Third, you don't just have common cause with your class if you're oppressed. You have common cause with your class because you're all oppressed. You're all suffering, which is how you can turn the lever on the oppressor class to get them to care. Fourth, oppression actually is a dynamic. There is no oppressed without an oppressor that oppresses them. So it's two pieces of a single dialectical relationship. And now you're leading them into Marxist thinking, even if they don't know it's Marxist. Holy crap, you're right. Wow, you blew my mind. He blew my mind. He said there's no oppression without an oppressor and an oppressed. So it's all part of one big dynamic. And fifth, this is the conflict, the intrinsic conflict that drives history. And either we can maintain the status quo or we can imagine what can be, unburdened by what has been. And sixth, by the way, did you realize that you are actually a historical actor within your class? You can change history yourself. Now you have class consciousness. And now that you have class consciousness, you have to act. That's the educability of class consciousness. That's teaching it in stages, and that's what George Lukács brought. That's actually, if you ask me, the real heart of cultural Marxism, especially together with the idea of social reification. Once you combine this idea with Gramsci's organic intellectuals, and then you come up with, as your ideal instructors, we call these people culturally relevant teachers today, which comes from Paulo Freire, basically. What you actually do is unlock and extend into what we end up getting as woke. This is the basis for where you get woke, especially in education, is you can teach people stage by stage to see themselves as an oppressed class who can unite to overthrow the chains of oppression that they're in by understanding the whole thing as a dialectical process. And they never have to hear the word dialectic to know that. They just have to feel it. They have to intuit it. Now, of course, this whole withering away of communism, or of socialism into communism, I should say, the withering away of the state is still a huge concern for Lukács. I just want to give you this to give you a flavor again of that Christ-centered theosophical state's going to sacrifice itself to save the world. It's present there too. He says, this is the only part of Lukács I'm going to read to you. He says, and you'll hear it's lucid but hard. Thus we must never, notice it started with thus, so you have to read the previous paragraph to know what the hell he was talking about. Thus, we must never overlook the distance that separates the consciousness of even the most revolutionary worker from the authentic class consciousness of the proletariat. So a regular old worker hasn't had that qualitative magical change Marx was talking about. He might be a crude communist, but he's not a transcendent communist yet. That would put him in the authentic class consciousness of the proletariat, which I told you how you educate people into that, or brainwash them or trick them into it. But even this situation can be explained on the basis of the Marxist theory of class struggle and class consciousness. The proletariat only perfects itself by annihilating and transcending itself. So there we go, right? By creating the classless society through the successful conclusion of its own class struggle. The struggle for this society in which the dictatorship of the proletariat is merely a phase is not just a battle waged against an external enemy, the bourgeoisie. It is equally the struggle of the proletariat against itself, against the devastating and degrading effects of the capitalist system upon its class consciousness. So you're constantly being poisoned by capitalist ideology, and you're going to become a class in order to get rid of class identity. And there's a contradiction there he's trying to resolve, right? So the proletariat will only have won the real victory when it has overcome these effects within itself. The separation of the areas that should be united, the diverse stages of consciousness which the proletariat has reached in the various spheres of activity, that's the graduated learning of consciousness that I was just talking about, are a precise index of what has been achieved and what remains to be done. The proletariat must not shy away from self-criticism, for victory can only be gained by the truth and self-criticism must therefore be its natural element. So in cultural Marxism in the West, we have this huge idea now that we're going to transform ourselves to become the communist man through showing how we failed to live up to our authentic qualitative change, class consciousness or critical consciousness or woke consciousness. And we constantly have to do this kind of religious self-criticism or confession in order to transform ourselves if we have any hope. Or otherwise we're going to be crude communists. And he's kind of probably, I don't know, because Lenin was at the height of this, he's talking about the dictatorship of the proletariat, and they were trying to solve these problems in 23. I think he wrote this chapter in 20, actually, so it's a little bit early. But certainly, at least looking back, maybe a little anachronistically, we understand that what the Soviets were doing turned into a monster. And Marcuse is very clear later, we'll talk about how Marcuse is very clear that the path that the Soviets followed was the wrong path. They weren't doing enough self-criticism. They weren't transforming themselves first, so they just made a gigantic industrial scale crude communism that's a huge problem, which is why we always hear real communism hasn't been tried. So this is actually in 1923, which turns out to be, I think, the year that Mao took over the CCP, very similar to Mao. Which is this, we're going to have an internal personal rebirth through sacrificing our own values to new values through self-criticism of our self-interest, our class interest. I can just say it again, right? Learning to see what can be, unburdened by what has been. We're just going to keep, I'm not kidding, we're going to hammer that to where it stops being funny. Now that you've kind of heard this educability of class consciousness and the transcending of your various, capitalist values and things, stage by stage, I want to read to you something that's deliberately the theosophical religion stuff, okay, just for comparison's sake. So this is a little bit of a wild aside, but I just want to really bring this out. So this is something you probably, unless you follow my podcast, probably haven't ever heard before, which is a passage from the most important Hermetic religious text, which is the Corpus Hermeticum. And as a matter of fact, the first book out of 17 books of the Corpus Hermeticum, which is titled the Poimandres. Poimandres is given in this text as the voice of God. God is referred to as the mind, or in Greek, nous. It's N-O-U-S, if you're looking it up, not the thing that they pretended was in a NASCAR garage. You have taught me these things well, as I wished, O nous. Now tell me how the way back is found. So this is the adept asking the mind of God to tell him, how do we get back to who we really are? Right? So this is about halfway through the Poimandres. To this, Poimandres replied, first, in the dissolution of the material body, one gives the body itself up to change. The form you had become becomes unseen, and you surrender to the divine power, your habitual character now being inactive. In other words, you can see what can be unburdened by what has been. The bodily senses return to their own sources. This is like when Marx talks about the transformation of communism giving you new eyes and ears with which to see the world through the socialist view. They then become parts again and rise for action while the seat of emotions and desire go to the mechanical nature. Thus, a man starts to rise up through the harmony of the cosmos. Imagine if it was a rise up through the harmony of class consciousness, right? To the first plane, he surrenders the activity of growth and diminution. To the second, the means of evil, trickery now being inactive. To the third, covetous deceit now inactive. And to the fourth, the eminence pertaining to a ruler being now without avarice. To the fifth, impious daring and reckless audacity. And to the sixth, evil impulses for wealth, all of these now being inactive. And to the seventh plane, the falsehood which awaits an ambush, which is believing that you've already made it when you haven't. So he's saying that you're going to now, to the way back is to start shedding. First, you get rid of a belief in the material world, in your physical body. That's not important. We have a class that we're going to identify with instead. We're going to be in solidarity with something larger than ourselves. We're going to give away our physical form and our individuality and mesh with something higher. And then we're going to go through all of the different vices and give them away one by another, rising, and this is the Hermetic religion, rising through the planes of enlightenment or planes of existence, the mental planes, so to speak, higher and higher and higher to try to achieve enlightenment. And then when you finally get there, He says, then, stripped of all activities of the cosmos, so now you just don't care about the world anymore at all, he enters the substance of the eighth plane with his own power, and he sings praises to the Father with those who are present. That would be the angels, by the way. And the substance of the eighth plane would be like, it's actually right before the pleroma, so it would be like Eden. You enter into that with your own power and sing the praises to the Father with those who are present. Those who are near rejoice at his coming, being made like to those who are there together, being made like to angels. He also hears certain powers which are above the eighth sphere, singing praises to God with a sweet voice. Then in due order they ascend to the Father, and they surrender themselves to the powers, and becoming the powers they are merged in God. This is the end, the supreme good for those who have had the higher knowledge, to become God. That's the goal. Now remember, Marx says we're going to get rid of God and replace God with man, but man as a single meta-organism that's socialist, right? So we could do this again, right? They ascend to the communist utopia, and they surrender themselves to the powers, and becoming the powers, they are merged in the species being. This is the end, the supreme good for those who have had the higher knowledge to become the species being. It's the exact same idea. And he says, well then, why do you delay? Should you not, having received all, become the guide to those who are worthy, so that the human race might be saved by God through you? Which that would be Christ, right? This is Christ consciousness is what it's describing. This is where Christ consciousness comes from. This is not a Christian idea. So when you hear the people on Oprah talking about Christ consciousness, or maybe some conservative mouthpieces talking about Christ consciousness, either they're ignorant of what they're talking about or they're not ignorant of what they're talking about, but it's certainly not Christian. And some would say that maybe comparing that to the educability of class consciousness presented in Lukács, but especially how Paulo Freire extended it to critical consciousness later, is a stretch, but I really don't think it is. I think we're reading the exact same religion in two very different contexts, one being, this kind of weird spiritual belief of the Hermeticists, and one being this social belief of the communists, but it's exactly the same model. The class, the proletariat, is replacing the individual, and when you understand that and rise up, you now must act so that humanity might be saved by you through your solidarity. Because the class, which is a whole, moves as does its parts, so you have to take action, you have to do praxis, you have to do the work. And self-criticism strips away the layers of the material fallen world that you've come to inhabit. The belief in individualism, the belief in private property, the belief that you can go make something of your life and not give over of your life to the collective. I think it's the exact same story, as a matter of fact. In fact, I think it's so strongly that I suspect Marx was aware of this and likely borrowed heavily from it in writing, especially economic philosophic manuscripts. But I haven't nailed down that case yet. That's a big project I don't have time for in the middle of a culture war. It's a little bit academic, honestly. So what we have then is, in collaboration with these guys, Gramsci and Lukács, back to earth, everybody. Back in collaboration with Gramsci and Lukács, we have the founders of the critical theory school in Germany collaborating, literally, and they're in regular communication also with Lenin, working out communism as it's supposed to spread to the West, which nobody knew how to do. And the founders of the Frankfurt School were in that conversation and eventually established a school for that purpose. It was established at Goethe University in Frankfurt in 1923. It was originally named very briefly, kind of like how Alice Bailey called her publishing company the Lucifer Publishing Company, and a couple of years later, that's 22, and in 24 she changed it to Lucis Trust, so people, it's two on the nose, right? Well, here, it was originally, the Frankfurt School was originally called the Institute for Marxism. And they thought, well, that might give it away. So they very quickly renamed it the Institute for Social Research. So social research is a Marxist euphemism for Marxism, or Marxist research, or really Western Marxist research. This project was to take existing social theory and show how it was inadequate to actually explain the conditions of the world, especially the currents that were developing around them, which included the World War, the rise of fascism, the weaknesses of liberalism, the flaws of capitalism, especially as it was developing in the industrial West, the shortcomings of Marxism both in the East and the West. They wanted to understand why all that was going on to formulate a better form of theory. At the outset of the Frankfurt School, its first decade or so, was actually designed to incorporate a lot of mythopoetic thinking, in other words, very religious, symbolic thinking, a lot of it being esoteric, symbolic thinking drawn from Jewish mysticism through Walter Benjamin, who I'm not going to talk about really at all. So they wanted to bring the mythopoetic into Marxist theory in order to make it a storyline that people could buy into without actually knowing what they're buying into. They also sought to incorporate very vigorously psychoanalytic and social theory, the sociology of Max Weber, the psychology of Sigmund Freud. Marcuse's first big project really was marrying Marx and Freud, which don't really go together perfectly well. Although, guess what? They're both currents in theosophical thought. So they can be hammered together because they're cousins within the same taxonomical tree of thinking. So the first director of the Frankfurt School, we're not going to talk about, just to name him though, was Karl Grunberg, and the first major player I just mentioned was probably Walter Benjamin, but we're also not going to talk about him just except to note that he was bringing in mythopoetic and mystical elements directly into the thinking. But the first significant player in the development of cultural Marxism into critical Marxism is Max Horkheimer, who became the director, that was the word I was looking for earlier, of the Institute in 1930. Not very long after he became the director of the Institute, they had to move because 1930s in Germany were not a good time. So Hitler took over in 1933, became chancellor, and these guys were all at least nominally Jewish, and so they got out of Dodge immediately, realizing the writing on the wall from the start. So they moved to Geneva briefly, and then, like I said, with Fabian help and likely Rockefeller money, they moved to the United States and colonized elite universities, particularly Columbia University first, Brandeis University, and then they moved some of them, Marcuse in particular, out to Southern California and bitched and complained about how nice everything was all the time. Andrew Breitbart, I think, has a very nice line about that they went out in the glorious Santa Monica sun and looked at the, everybody having fun on the beach and just grumbled about how terrible it all is. These stupid people just don't get it. So Horkheimer developed a critical theory in an essay, although I would almost call it a book, called Traditional and Critical Theory in 1937. It's like 80 pages. It's really an unpleasant read. I read the whole thing again the other day for like the 7th time. He actually developed the theory, but not this essay, in conjunction with his associate Theodor Adorno, who I've now mentioned and probably won't talk about anymore. He's most famous, Theodor Adorno is probably most famous not for his hatred of jazz, which is true, but also for creating the authoritarian personality scale, the so-called F scale, the fascist scale, which basically is an 890-page pseudo-psychological book concluding that conservatives are fascists. And you can rate how fascist somebody is by how conservative they are. It's a really shoddy bit of work that's extremely long and therefore unpleasant to try to read or pick apart. So critical theory, which was developed by Horkheimer, is the engine of critical Marxism, which is what we're going to call it, critical Marxism. We're going to try to get used to saying that. Instead of critical theory, which euphemizes it, we're going to call it critical Marxism. And it focuses not on capitalism itself, but the ideology of capitalism. That's very important because now we're trying to undermine the social belief in capitalism. It actually rehabilitates Hegel's dialectical methods, but still criticizing Hegel. It doesn't accept Hegel, but becomes more Hegelian, I guess is a good way to put it. And they claim that they were trying to take the abstractions of Marxism and put them into a more concrete setting. In other words, bring them to the realities, the social realities that people were really in. It seeks to attack the means of capitalist cultural production, which uphold people's belief in the capitalist system. So it attacks a thing that they called the culture industry. They said that the capitalist project was manufacturing a culture to sell to people an image of how they're supposed to be that they would then go purchase in consumer goods and want to go to work to purchase. So you'd work your butt off all day because you're watching commercials for Chevrolet's Corvettes, and you want a Corvette so you can wash it on Saturday and tool around and drive and down the strip and everything and look cool in your convertible. And so you go to work and bust your balls for somebody else specifically so you can have your cool little trinket that you were marketed You work at the Chevy factory so you can buy a Chevy, right? And so you are working hard for the Chevrolet bosses so that you can own a piece of the company, and really you're doing the master's bidding and not even realizing it, and have been flattened out into a one-dimensional person. There's a really interesting movie, I think it's from the 90s, a documentary that's worth watching if you haven't. It's called Merchants of Cool, where they talk about how MTV had become deliberate in doing this. They were going around to the youth cultures and finding out what was cool, and then they were packaging it up as MTV programming as MTV started to shift away from actually showing music, so that they could sell cool to the next generation and produce all of the consumer products that people would want to buy. So if you haven't ever seen Merchants of Cool, it was a real eye-opener for me at least 20 years ago when I watched it. The purpose of critical theory in criticizing all of this and saying that it's all so cynical like that is, as Max Horkheimer phrased it, it is the struggle for a higher stage of man's life in community. We could characterize that in Kamala's words if we want, right? But it's the same transformative religion. And this higher stage, there's your logic of the spiral that we're seeing of the same transformative religion project. There's a higher stage of life that we can have in a community, but you yahoos can't see it because you're too busy buying your Corvette because Chevy marketed it to you and you got tricked by the marketing, which is a form of propaganda, blah, 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 blah. It's capitalist propaganda. So this essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, is really long. Let me just emphasize. It's only 80 pages, so it's not super, super long, but it's like when you read it, it's 18 days long. Because it doesn't feel like it says anything ever. It's not just got every paragraph starts with this, so you have to read back to figure out what it is. It's hard to see if he's making a point at all. You would think, so if you were a normal person and not a Marxist, and you were going to write an essay defining critical theory, you would probably at some point in the beginning of the essay say, okay, I conceive of the critical theory this way, this is what I mean by that term, this is what it is. He doesn't do that. He rambles for 40 pages about theory in general and the shortcomings of traditional theory, and then he just starts comparing it to critical theory without ever really telling you what it is. I read it, the whole damn thing, last week again because I wanted to find you like the money quote where he defines critical theory, and it's never there. It's not there. It's all this waffle so that the people who are kind of understanding what he's saying are picking it up, but if you read it, you just kind of go blind. Now, Horkheimer at one point, if I remember rightly, said that they did this on purpose because they thought that the very language and structure of how we communicate is captured by the capitalist ideology. So they can't put things in this rigid form that you'd be able to see plainly what it would be, because then you're just feeding into the system of capitalist organization, which sounds an awful lot like the white supremacy culture stuff that the Smithsonian published a couple of years ago, right? The whole of our society, everything that works, everything that functions is the bad stuff, and it all has to be undone by talking in euphemisms and talking in circles and everything else. But he does consistently at least present critical theory as a different way of thinking that cannot actually be comprehended or accepted by the existing way of thinking or people trapped in it, which is traditional theory. So it's inherently conspiratorial in a sense, but it's sort of this like conspiracy that everybody's a part of but nobody knows they're a part of. He also says that the point of it is that the entire way of thinking that our society engages in is naturally hostile to Marxist change. That is transformation. And this isn't taken by him as a hint that the theory might be bad. It is taken as proof that society is corrupt. So this is the normal Gnostic thing. We know the secret, you don't, so, we're good and you're bad. So here's how this is one of the closest points to where I can actually quote him, and he says exactly what I'm saying he's saying. He says, every part of the theory presupposes the critique of the existing order and the struggle against it along lines determined by the theory itself. I'm telling you, it's 80 pages of that. We'll read a little bit more. Why do you have to have this? He says the critical theory of society is in its totality. I think this is the closest to a definition he gets. The critical theory of society is in its totality the unfolding of a single existential judgment. To put it in broad terms, the theory says that the basic form of the historically given commodity economy on which modern history rests contains in itself the internal and external tensions of the modern era. It generates these tensions over and over again in increasingly heightened form, and after a period of progress, development of human powers and emancipation for the individual, after an enormous extension of human control over nature, it finally hinders further development and drives humanity into a new barbarism. So critical theory is designed because capitalism works and works and works and works and works until it doesn't, and it's a disaster, so we better criticize it before it gets there. and the society is getting increasingly barbarous, but the people trapped in it can't see it. So they're going to enlighten us to how bad our good lives really are. And the reason it's barbarous is because it's all consuming. Barbarous here, by the way, means not transformed or not Marxist, haven't gone through that qualitative change of seeing what can be unburdened by what has been. This sentiment is actually the thesis of their magnum opus, of the entire Frankfurt School's magnum opus, which is called The Dialectic of Enlightenment, which was published in 1947, 10 years later, by Horkheimer and Adorno together, which basically that's a painful, confusing read. It's all just shot through with mythology, so if you're not up on your Greek mythology to the highest level, you can't understand what they're talking about at all, because it's all symbolism and myths, and when you invoke Eros or you invoke Aphrodite, then blah, 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 and you don't know what he's talking about unless you go read all of that too. But the thrust is that reason becomes myth, and reason becomes unreason, and all of this myth and unreason sets up a tyranny that parades itself as liberal freedom, but in fact is a new tyranny of stupidity. And it can't even tell that it's doing it. That's the dialectic of enlightenment. The enlightenment thinking unfolds to this point of being basically the COVID protocols. So critical theory bills itself as being more engaged than traditional theory. The liberal theory, even traditional Marxist theory, is airy and detached. This is actually down in the trenches. It's understanding. It's not alienated from what it studies, and thus it's not alienating people from the object of study. It's culturally relevant. That's not Horkheimer's word for it. That's the current word. And it's also doing the work that's necessary because of its engagement. By the way, cultural relevant teaching is sold as being more engaging to the students than other forms of education. The goal is to seize the means of production of the culture industry so that you can produce the culture and veer it toward socialism. So this is like Gramsci's organic intellectuals, but really on an entire system scale. And it's, of course, touched through its engagement with lived experience while remaining analytical. So it's kind of two-dimensional thinking. It's more advanced. It's also not crude and totalitarian like Stalin. So he specifically actually says this. He says, critical theory is neither deeply rooted like totalitarian propaganda, nor detached like the liberal intelligentsia. So it's actually the ideal way to think about the world. So he actually, in 1969, near the end of his life, he actually gave an interview and tells you why he actually created the critical theory. And it says, the critical theory I conceived later is based on the idea that one cannot determine what is good, what a good free society would look like from within the society which we now live in. We lack the means. But in our work, we can bring up the negative aspects of the society that we wish to change. So that's what critical theory is really about. It's to complain about everything in our society and not know what to do that would be better, but we can definitely complain about what we have. And so this becomes actually a negative transformative theology, right? We're going to strip away those different planes of contamination and rise up through the planes. It's very hermetic in that way. We're not actually able to see what can be, but we still can be unburdened by what has been, by bitching about it all the time. And it is a completely negative philosophy or theology. It is all criticism, all the time. And the belief is actually magical. It is that it's alchemical, actually. It's that the ideal society will blossom from what's left over when you strip away all the bad elements of the existing society through the ruthless criticism of all that exists that Marx said. Herbert Marcuse was actually explicit about this point. He says, negative thinking is by virtue of its own internal concepts positive, oriented toward and comprehending a future which is contained in the present. So we have all the pieces we need to have a perfect socialist society, but we have all this capitalist crap in the way. And if we can strip all that away, the seed of gold of society can blossom. That's how alchemy is supposed to work. The lead has seeds of gold in it. If you can strip away the mundane metal, the gold will blossom and the entire lump of metal will turn to gold. That's actually how alchemy is supposed to work. It's a negative alchemical process of burning away that which is fallen in order to emancipate that which is divine from within. The divine spark of society can be emancipated through criticism of the fallen aspects, which means belief in private property and individualism. Horkheimer actually kind of says this near the end of traditional and critical theory. He says, for all its insight into the individual steps in social change and for all the agreement of its elements with the most advanced traditional theories, the critical theory has no specific influence on its side except concern for the abolition of social injustice. There you go, guys. What's social justice? There you go. This negative formulation, if we wish to express it abstractly, is the materialist content of the idealist concept of reason. Ooh, spooky. It's a dialectic of idealism and realism. In a historical period like the present, true theory is more critical than affirmative, as the society that corresponds to it cannot be called productive. The future of humanity depends on the existence today of the critical attitude, which of course contains within it elements from traditional theories and from our own declining culture generally. Mankind has already been abandoned by a science which is in its imaginary self-sufficiency, thinks of the shaping of practice, which it serves and to which it belongs, simply as something lying outside its borders and content with its separation of thought and action. So we're going to transform the world by complaining about it until people slough off the existing world and a new world, which is socialist, emerges. And that brings us to Marcuse, but one more ominous comment from Horkheimer was, the change which critical theory seeks to bring about is not effected gradually, so that its success, even if slow, might be steady. In other words, it's still revolutionary. And of course, critical theory on its own didn't get anywhere because nobody knew what the hell it was talking about, and it wasn't very interesting. And it didn't even really get into the universities because I don't even think anybody at the time knew what it was talking about. And it was all negative. It wasn't really, they were railing on what's called the positivist movement. That was kind of the big thrust in philosophy at the time. It was like, we're going to be able to describe everything. We're going to understand it all in real terms. And it just didn't get very far. It was just these kind of dorks that were somehow well-funded, who did work in some universities and built up little discipleships, especially Marcuse, but it didn't change anything, really. So it's just like planting seeds that are about to grow into a nightmare most of a century later. So now we turn to Herbert Marcuse. He's, I think, the most important figure in Western Marxism. He's the pivotal figure. We'll talk about him in the next lecture as well. He is definitely the most influential leftist in the West, with the possible competitors of Paulo Freire and Michel Foucault. So it's the critical education guy and the postmodern guy, but he's probably the most influential. Here's how a CIA document about Marcuse described his relevance. And this is out of context, it's just a description. There are these things called the 3 M's. There's a chant that they were giving in the 60s, the 3 M's, which were Marx, Mao, Marcuse. Marx, Mao, Marcuse. The radicals would chant those 3 names. So they're obviously somehow related and significant of what that movement represented. And so the way the CIA actually summarized it was Marx the God, Marcuse his prophet, and Mao his sword. And so that's kind of what came together to produce what we're dealing with today. So Marcuse is different than these other guys. He's still wholly negative, but he's actually utopian in his outlook. He's open about the possibility of a utopia being born in the world. And so his 1960s critical theory, I'm not going to talk about his 1950s work, is what I would call negative utopian. The utopia is to be freed from the existing society through critique. And his actual method was called the Great Refusal. His goal was to get the people to reject the entirety of the society that they live in on all levels, to create a vacuum of belief that could then be filled in with a demand for socialism. So in his essay on liberation, written in 1969, he says, but while the image of the libertarian potential of advanced industrial society, notice lots of euphemisms here. Libertarian potential means becoming socialist. Advanced industrial society means capitalist America with social reforms and worker protections. So while the image of the libertarian potential of industrial society, and I put in parentheses because there's a lot of like back here, which doesn't have to work because technology can meet, or no, that we don't have to work because technology can meet our needs is what he's actually talking about in context here. So that's what advanced industrial society would provide, is a place where technology, automation makes it so none of us have to work very much, which is the main Marxist fever dream. So since the image of libertarian potential is repressed and hated by the managers of repression and their consumers, It motivates the radical opposition. He could just say the corporate bosses and the people who buy stuff, but he doesn't. The managers of repression and their consumers. It motivates the radical opposition. You could actually say who he means, but he doesn't, and gives it a strange, unorthodox character. Very different from the revolution at previous stages of history, this opposition is directed against the totality of a well-functioning, prosperous society. A protest against a society that works, he says. But then he adds, parenthetically, a protest against its form, with a capital F. So not even the existing capitalist society, but its Platonic ideal has to be rejected on principle. We're going to reject the totality of a well-functioning, prosperous society, the commodity form of men and things, against the imposition of false values and false morality, which of course he'll determine for you what's true and what's false. This new consciousness in the instinctual rebellion isolate such opposition from the masses and from the majority of organized labor, the integrated majority, and make for the concentration of radical politics in active minorities, mainly among the young middle-class intelligentsia, and among the ghetto populations, which Stalin and Lenin would have called the backwards people. Here, prior to all political strategy and organization, liberation becomes a vital biological need. So we're talking about really transforming who people are, because becoming a socialist becomes a biological need, and it actually starts in active minorities, the young middle-class intelligentsia, and the backwards people in the ghettos. So who are in the ghettos, by the way? You're probably thinking racial minorities, but it included sexual minorities. It included people that were excluded from the university, like critical theorists and feminists and so on. But let's do a close read on some of his language. Protest against the totality of a well-functioning, prosperous society, against its Platonic form. Like, that's a protest against what has been, that we could be unburdened from, right? And so, what's it supposed to give us? It's supposed to give us a new consciousness and instinctual rebellion. You don't have to know why you're rebelling. It's an instinct to rebel because it's your biological need, right? So we're having a protest against what has been that's instinctual in nature because of a new consciousness. In other words, by people who've been led to see what can be, which is real socialism. And this necessitates a new revolutionary base because the working class has been stabilized by the fact that they have good jobs and can make money and build a life and a home and a family. So the fealty to the working class can now wither away. I put in my notes, lol. But that's really important because communism's gone corporate now, and you have to get away from caring about the work or pretending to care about the working class in order to get to that place. And the goal is to do this among people who have been given a biological need for socialism, and that appears in the 3rd chapter of Essay on Liberation. But the first chapter of this essay is actually titled A Biological Foundation for Socialism, which sounds a little bit like eugenics, but he's very clear to me not literal biology, some other kind of biology where the vital needs are. So psychological biology, I guess. In other words, spiritual evolution instead of physical evolution, but still spiritual eugenics nonetheless, which is exactly what this whole religion is about. So what does it really mean if it's not literal biology? It means destabilizing people until they can't handle the world that they live in, so they instinctually rebel against it. That means making people crazy. It means making destabilized youth and then feeding them what he calls in the 2nd chapter, a new sensibility of how the world's supposed to be. We call it sustainability and inclusion. That is, we give them a new social contract, which is a complete inside-out transformation of society. And then he gets really very theosophical if we go back to that biological foundation for socialism chapter. Again, I apologize for his difficult wording, and I won't draw it out too much for you. Notice the first word of this paragraph. This union, shit, we have to go back and read more every time. You cannot succinctly quote these people. This union provokes such a response because it reveals the prospective scope of social change at this stage of development. Spiral of history. The extent to which the radical political practice involves a cultural subversion. The refusal with which the opposition confronts the existing society is affirmative in that it envisages a new culture which fulfills the humanistic promises betrayed by the old culture. So here we could reference Marxist comments about each society being the midwife or pregnant with the next. We could also say able to see what can be, unburdened by what has been. Political radicalism, he says, thus implies moral radicalism. So you got to change your values. The emergence of a morality which might precondition man for freedom. Freedom means socialism here. This radicalism activates the elementary organic foundation of morality in the human being. So there's that hermetic transformation we just read. Prior to all ethical behavior in accordance with specific social standards, prior to all ideological expression, morality is a disposition of the organism, perhaps rooted in the erotic drive to counter aggressiveness, to create and preserve ever greater unities of life. So again, we have this new thought, kind of hermetic theosophical concept of unity, kind of driving this new unity on a new basis, as Mao called it. He says we would then have this side of all values, an instinctual foundation for solidarity among human beings. Instinctual. We've changed what people actually automatically gravitate to, even if they don't know why. A solidarity which has been effectively repressed in line with the requirements of class society, but which now appears as a precondition for liberation. In other words, you have to have this transformation at the biological level so new man can proceed, not be created. So it's not like Lenin. Now, you thought we were done because that was long, but no, that was only the first part because we have to do the rest of it. To the degree to which this foundation is itself historical and the malleability of human nature reaches into the depth of man's instinctual nature, changes in morality may sink down into the biological dimension and modify organic behavior. This means that people can be brainwashed. If you destabilize them enough, they're going to go crazy and have needs, and you can brainwash them into that and what they crave on the way out. Once a specific morality is firmly established as the norm of social behavior, it is not only introjected, it operates as a norm of organic behavior. So there's our social reification process. And we're using radicalizable communities as the cells of transformation in society. He says once that happens, the organism receives and reacts to certain stimuli and ignores and repels others in accord with the introjected morality. That means they're in a cult. You ever tried to talk to a woke person and they, what does it say here? Receives and reacts to certain stimuli and ignores or repels others in accordance with his morality? Yeah, which is an introjected morality? Right. Where do I leave off? Cult, okay. Which is thus promoting or impeding the function of the organism as a living cell in the respective society. Same idea we've been talking about the whole time. In this way, a society constantly recreates this side of consciousness and ideology, patterns of behavior and aspiration as part of the nature of its people. And unless the revolt reaches into this second nature, into these ingrown patterns, social change will remain incomplete and even self-defeating. So we have to transform people through massive brainwashing. In fact, my notes say, WTF is this lunatic talking about? He's talking about the inversion of praxis, your historical conditions, conditioning man at the level of his biological need and vital self, but that's so pervasive that what you actually have to do is you have to get him to refuse the entire process. Because capitalist society is constantly doing this in a way that supports more capitalism. And we'll go to barbarism and fascism, obviously, and then he says repeatedly, nuclear weapons, apparently. So this has to be disrupted from within, from inside out change, values change, to transform who they are. And the way that this is done is through wholly negative theology, beating them over the head till they're destabilized and crazy and crave this new thing that they've been convinced, this utopia they think that we might be able to get to. If that doesn't sound like woke, I don't know what does, because that's exactly where woke really comes from. So you're introjecting these new values and hoping it sinks down to the instinctual level, which means they don't have to have read a page of theory to act that way because you've transformed what they value. They're so anti-racist and pro-social justice that that's who they are. And he specifically, as we heard, said that you're mostly going to do this with the young middle-class intelligentsia, which means brainwashing students. And he also heard that it's going to require using not workers, but identity politics. Why would he say that stuff? Because he was a Maoist, openly, by confession. And so he was adopting Mao's successful cultural revolution tactics to the West. He's one of the disease vectors for Maoism into America. So in an interview with Pierre, God, that's a French name, Vincent Pont, we'll pretend I said that right, in 1969, the same year, the question he was asked was, you've been bracketed with Marx and Mao when people talk of the three M's, Marx, Mao, Marcuse. What is your reaction? So that's the question Marcuse gets asked, and he says, I don't understand. Marx, I have studied his work deeply, but Mao, certainly today every Marxist who is not a communist of strict obedience is a Maoist. So of course I'm a Maoist, is what he's saying. Every Marxist who's not an old school commie of strict obedience is a Maoist now. Mao has affected the transformation of Marxist thought, and of course I'm one. He said, I've always thought that there was an alternative to capitalism. In my books, I have not kept to the old Marxist ideology. Socialist societies, as they are set up today, do not seem to me what I call quantitatively different. I'm assuming there's a word missing there. Seem to be what I call qualitatively different from other capitalist societies. They allow one type of domination to exist instead of another. That is all. True socialism is something else again. It's an enlightened position, right? I'm convinced that it is possible from now on to construct a truly socialist society without going through a Stalinist type period. A socialist society must be founded on true solidarity, on true cooperation. So now he gives us some great examples of that working out, right? He says, the Cuban Revolution seems to me to be moving in that direction. As for Che, meaning Che Guevara, he was the symbol of it, very far from the Stalinist bureaucrats, very near to socialist man. Yep, that's what they're really about right there. Che Guevara, major murderer, not a good dude, not a good guy. So bookmark all of that for the next lecture. We'll come back to it. So we're really only getting through critical Marxism, it looks like right now, but two other significant ideas are repressive tolerance, which I'll just kind of touch on. Repressive tolerance is the two-tier system of government that we have. I'll skip everything that he actually says about how it's actually set up and read to you the definition. Liberating tolerance then would mean intolerance against movements from the right and toleration of movements from the left. Pretty straightforward. As to the scope of this tolerance and intolerance, it would extend to the stage of action as well as discussion and propaganda of deed as well as word. He said the goal of actually this would be to prevent the idea from ever entering conservatives' heads. So that would involve not just censorship, but something he calls pre-censorship, which I believe we experience on social media constantly. Go try to Google Trump or something and you just get pictures of Kamala. You don't even get a chance to see what's actually going on because they are pre-censoring your information. That's, in a sense, worse. He also calls for the long march through the institutions explicitly after his silly little revolution in 1968 failed, and he was really mad. He wrote a book called Counter-Revolution of Revolt in 1972, and he said, to extend the base of the student movement, Rudi Dutschke has proposed the strategy of the long march through the institutions, working against the established institutions while working within them. But not simply by boring from within, rather by doing the job. Learning how to program and read computers, how to teach at all levels of education, how to use the mass media, how to organize production, how to recognize and eschew planned obsolescence, how to design, etc., and at the same time preserving one's own consciousness and working with the others. In other words, he's describing now a viral model of spreading Gramsci's organic intellectual consciousness from institution to institution. And this could go on for days. We're already actually kind of over the time by a lot. I don't want to steal from your question and answer time. But we've got actually some other things to talk about, unfortunately. We won't talk anymore about that. I'm not going to dwell on the postmodernists, but I do want to touch on them. I would say that postmodernism could be called meaning Marxism or deconstructive Marxism. It's the idea that some people have the power to set what things mean, symbols, words, texts, and other people don't. And they therefore contour our experience of society at a very fundamental level. They are always pre-censoring everything in a sense. And you might think, wow, that sounds like maybe what they're weaponizing against us. And I think that that's really what we need to take away from postmodernism, is that they're weaponizing postmodern techniques against us in order to affect their tyranny today. The big kind of takeaway is from postmodernism, though, is that they came up with, not just with this Marxist theory of meaning making, but of also of truth. That truth is actually just a socially constructed phenomenon, and true is what society accepts as true. And that's going to be something Michel Foucault spent most of his work criticizing, and that is obviously the social reification idea of Lukács taken to another level. Power, they would say, is actually tied up directly with knowledge. Not knowledge as power, like Francis Bacon said, but power knowledge as a single hyphenated concept. as Foucault put it forth. And what that is that power actually moves through everybody all the time, through policing, through language, through the structure of society, how we are to understand a text, like, hunting for the author's intention with the words that he wrote instead of what you decide to take from it. And these were called discourses, which is why we are at a new discourses event, because we need some new ones because theirs are all poisoned. We have the character that I did an entire workshop on last year called Jean Baudrillard. He's basically the guy, and they all get mad when you say this, that was The Matrix. The Matrix was an attempt to portray and film his philosophy that he said did a very bad job of it, but he said that we actually live in a desert of the real, everything symbols of symbols of symbols of symbols, replications of replications of replications, and we've lost the original, so we actually can't access reality at all. So power is therefore maintained over people by the constant creation of artificial images as the form of propaganda. Again, I encourage you to believe you live in that world on social media. I have lots of things I like to talk about with him. Lots of focus on language. That's Jacques Derrida. That's all we're going to say about Jacques Derrida today. You can check out my friend Local Distance and hear more about Jacques Derrida than you ever wanted to hear in your life. But I don't think that thinking of this as post-Marxist or this kind of, just flopping existentialism taken to its nihilistic finish is the best way to think about it. I mean, Foucault is definitely Nietzschean in his orientation. I think he was trying to become Nietzsche's character of Zarathustra, if you know that story, who's the moralless man who therefore becomes Superman. The Superman is the man with no morals because he can't be told how to be by anybody. And I think that Foucault embodied that ambition. But I actually kind of want to talk about kind of the guru dynamic and just one other thing here with the postmodern. The guru dynamic is this deconstruction means that nobody can make sense of anything for themselves at all. And therefore you need spirit guides through the universe. In other words, you need a gender theorist to tell you whether a man is a man and a woman is a woman. If nobody can make that adjudication for themselves, you need people who can guide you through it, and who better than the enlightened postmodernists or the gender theorists or the critical race theorists who can tell you what's racist and what's not. It turns out that it's racist if a conservative says it or does it, and it's not racist if a leftist says it or does it. And they are the new enlightened elect who are going to be the gurus of this kind of weird hippie truthiness world that we're all forced to live in. And speaking of this truthiness, a Marxist theory of what is and isn't true and when truth is, and Lukács's social reification, the other point I really want to bring up is legitimation by parology, which is a big fancy term, which means believing stuff because of social consensus. This was put forth by Jean-François Lyotard in his book, The Postmodern Condition. And so if you can force people to believe in a paralogical world, a false set of beliefs, then that's true. It's legitimated and made true within that society. Now, of course, his critique was that that's what we live in already, and I say that that's what they realized that they need to use to weaponize against us. And they use a tool called nudge theory, primarily to nudge us into a new social reality and understanding. So just as a point of historical reference, who on earth would be interested in this crap? This is a universal acid. It tears apart everything. It confuses everything. It's not popular in France. Who on earth would care about this? Feminists. That's overwhelmingly the answer. It turns out post-colonialists too, but feminists. Because feminists were so desperate to deconstruct the connection between sex and sex roles that they would pick up anything that could tear it apart. They wanted to absolutely leave behind the idea that there might be intrinsic traits to men and women that statistically but not individually suit them toward things in preferential directions. They wanted to destroy that so much and to separate gender from sex so much that they imported the French postmodern theories and incorporated it with their critical theory of patriarchy. So woke Marxism is the blend of all of that, including the American Maoism imported by Marcuse, including the postmodern feminism or post-structuralist feminism as it's called, and including critical pedagogy, which we haven't talked about yet. So if you think that woke sucks, think a feminist. And they get really mad when they're blamed for it, but it's all their fault. It is almost all their fault. CRT is race Marxism. This is our woke section. CRT is race Marxism. Gender ideology is a critical constructivist epistemology of sex and sex roles. Queer theory is a critical constructivist epistemology of sexuality and sex. Post-colonial theory is downstream from anti-imperialist Soviet efforts that adopted postmodern and critical methods to make it be about national origin. Fat studies, gender studies, and disability studies and so on are just kind of laughing stocks that come along with these programs. But what it actually is it's all Mao's, these are the pieces of Mao's identity politics imported to the American context, hence American Maoism. And like I said, we blame Herbert Marcuse for that importation. And for figuring out the way to set all of the, what did he call them, middle-class intelligentsia, youth, student intelligentsia, and ghetto populations against themselves, each other, and society. And this is where we get DEI, the theory that informs DEI, and everything else all the way downstream. But all of that wasn't going to be enough. The activists and the universities alone weren't, I think, going to be enough to turn us woke. Education theory was needed to actually take all these ingredients and forge them in a crucible into woke. And the reason that education theory is the place where it could all come together is because education theory has a different goal, which is to educate or miseducate students, depending on if you're Marxist or not, right? So they have a purpose that allows them to pick and choose as they need. In other words, they get to be syncretistic again. They get to pick which pieces they want and throw out which pieces they don't, because their real objective is to forge an educational theory that allows them to bypass the reproduction of society from one generation to the next. It actually comes out of the perversion of religion in the anti-imperialist campaigns of the Soviets. In other words, liberation theology as it developed primarily in South America. Overwhelmingly, liberation theology becomes the bed in which critical education theory was formed. I already did a whole four-lecture workshop on critical pedagogy, so we're not doing the nuts and bolts. I just want to say that this probably created, Herbert Marcuse and Paulo Freire created the ground game, where Mao and Mao's successor, Deng Xiaoping, and maybe George Soros have created the air game, so to speak, that has allowed them to wage this information war against us. But I do want to tell you how religious Paulo Freire is and what he's brought, because we've had different models of revolution, and I told you last night at the end that Mao brought in a model of continuous revolution, and that's what Paulo Freire brings very explicitly. In order to wage, if you successfully wage one revolution, the first thing you do after you win is start another one. It's a continuous revolution. Mao talked about every single project as the next phase in the revolution, which is this ongoing project that he could use to mobilize people. But what Paulo Freire, in this kind of softer way, very hippie way, says is because men are, this is a really important theosophical point, by the way, because men are historical beings, incomplete and conscious of being incomplete, revolution is as natural and permanent to human dimension as is education. So we are incomplete and know that we're incomplete. So like we've heard from the theosophists I started with, our goal is to complete ourselves. And socialism is how we do that. Only a mechanistic mentality, he says, holds that education can create at a certain point, or that revolution can be halted when it attains power. To be authentic, revolution must be a continuous event. Otherwise, it will cease to be revolution. It will become sclerotic bureaucracy. So this is that desalinization thing hitting everywhere. Revolution is always cultural, whether it be in the phase of denouncing an oppressive society and proclaiming the advent of a just society, or in the phase of the new society inaugurated by the revolution. In the new society, the revolutionary process becomes cultural revolution. So he's pulling in Mao. He says that his method of education was based off of Mao. That's in a footnote in chapter 1 in Pedagogy of the Oppressed that he explicitly says that. What we'll see, I think, is later, or at some point I mentioned, or can just say it now, is that he actually is importing this from Stalin. Stalin actually explicitly said, actually Lenin said too, that all education, to be education, must be political education. And that's really what critical pedagogy is about. All education has to contain political brainwashing elements. And what Paulo Freire brought to the world was a way to get that under the radar so that it could be incorporated in our schools without realizing it, because his idea was that education, or the material of education, the curriculum is a mediator to political knowledge. In other words, the math question or math test is an excuse to have a political conversation with the students. And that's exactly how they teach now, and they're extremely good at it. Now, this all was codified not by Paulo Freire. He called what he did education for liberation, education for seeing what can be unburdened by what has been. But it got incorporated with these European theorists by Paulo Freire's main disciple, whose name was Henry Giroux. And that was further codified by a guy at McGill University in Canada called Joe Kincheloe, who is the one who coined the official name, the technical name for what woke is, which is critical constructivist epistemology, which I could dedicate a whole couple of lectures to that probably, but we're not going to. I just want to point out that this really is a religion. Here's what Joe Kincheloe said about critical constructivist epistemology. He said, in this unified context, critical constructivism becomes a Weltanschauung, that is a worldview that creates meaning on the nature of human existence. So he knows it's a religion. They're teaching religion in our schools. They know they are. He says it explicitly. What is critical constructivist? Critical equals critical theory, constructivist equals postmodernism. So there's your fusion of those two. It happened in education using critical pedagogy as the excuse to do it, and all the theory mixed together in our education schools primarily more than anywhere else. And it creates a Marxist way of knowing, or a Marxist theory of knowledge. There are certain people who say, I'm a knower, my knowledge is official, your knowledge is outside or insufficient, indigenous knowledge is, or superstitions or whatever, we're going to exclude them. So some people are allowed to know and other people are not allowed to know, and you have a Marxist theory of knowledge and knowing. And Freire said that the point of this is to bypass it and use education to conscientize, to awaken to a, not class consciousness now, but a critical consciousness in line with what Horkheimer laid out. And so we're going to go with Lukács's education of class consciousness into a further education that adds in that once you finally get your revolution, if you want the proletariat to wither away like it's supposed to overcome itself, like Lukács said, you have to initiate another revolution. And then as soon as you get that, you have to do another one and another one. In other words, that we're never quite done. And we get back to that Pygmalion idea of carve away, carve away, carve away, carve away, and hope Aphrodite shows up to give us communism someday. But this is that kind of constant movement idea that we read in Teilhard that we started with, right? So it also allows something very important, which I did a podcast on and said that this makes Marxism stupid. That critical education made Marxism stupid. But what it means is that every single person in their own personal context, which is what woke is about, can now make their own homegrown agitprop about anything. Outside is racist, the sun is racist, being able to go fishing is racist, everything is racist. Everybody can just make it up and whine about it. We've got the person in the Olympics right now doing their made-up breakdancing because the real moves are somehow oppressive and anti-queer, so they come out and fling their arms and legs around, and somehow we're all supposed to honor this and think it's fantastic, and this person has a PhD in queer breakdancing because our universities sold us out by making all of this acceptable. But all of this is just recycled communist practice. It's all just communist practice. But the goal within education, before I tell you how religious it is and close this up, the goal within education is actually, like I said, to make the academic material a mediator to knowledge so you can hide or hijack the educational process without parents knowing that it's happening. Because the goal is to defeat the pattern of social reproduction. We just heard one of them, Marcuse or Horkheimer, complain again and again that society reproduces itself and reproduces itself and reproduces itself. Well, how are you going to do that? Well, you get the kids, that's how. And you give them a qualitatively different understanding of the world. And we'll hear later this afternoon that's exactly what Klaus Schwab says you do too. So here's how religious this is, though. This is a long quote I've read many times, but I want to share this from Paulo Freire to understand what we're actually dealing with in terms of woke being a religion. And what they're teaching in schools is based off of him. And here's how he conceives of what he's doing. This new apprenticeship something you have to go read before. This new apprenticeship will violently break down the elitist concept of existence they had absorbed while being ideologized. In other words, while becoming capitalist, right? The sine qua non, the highest understanding that this apprenticeship demands is that first of all, they really experience their own Easter. That they die as elitists so as to be resurrected on the side of the oppressed. that they be born again with the beings who are not allowed to be. Such a process implies a renunciation of myths that are dear to them, the myth of their superiority, of the purity of their soul, of their virtues, their wisdom, the myth that they save the poor, the myth of the neutrality of the church, of theology, education, science, technology, the myth of their own impartiality. Doesn't that sound like those hermetic levels that you have to strip away the 7 planes? From these, and you go through your own Easter. So on the 8th plane, you attain Christ consciousness. It's the exact same model. From these grow the other myths, the inferiority of other people, of their spiritual and physical impurity, and of the absolute ignorance of the oppressed, the people who are not allowed to know, thus they're not allowed to be. This Easter, which results in the changing of consciousness, must be existentially experienced. The real Easter is not commemorative rhetoric, what you do at church. It is praxis. It is historical involvement. The old Easter of rhetoric is dead with no hope of resurrection. It is only in the authenticity of historical praxis that Easter becomes the death that makes life possible. But the bourgeois worldview, basically necrophiliac, which is to say death-loving, and therefore static is not moving, Teilhard, is unable to accept the supremely biophiliac, life-living, Teilhard, moving, experience of Easter. The bourgeois mentality, which is far more than just a convenient abstraction, kills the profound historical dynamism of Easter and turns it into no more than a date on the calendar. There's your Christian Easter, guys. That's what they think of it. The lust to possess, the sign of the necrophiliac worldview, rejects the deeper meaning of resurrection. Why would I be interested in rebirth if I hold in my hands as objects to be possessed the torn body and soul of the oppressed? Notice the clear iconography to Christ. I can only experience rebirth at the side of the oppressed by being born again with them in the process of liberation. I cannot turn such a rebirth into a means of owning the world, since it is essentially a means of transforming the world. So he's literally saying that the oppressed are what Christ represented, and rather than go through your own personal Easter and become your own Christ, you'd rather use that imagery, use their literal physical oppressed bodies in exploitative practices. And if it's not clear that this is religious enough, Henry Giroux is an outright commie, right? His disciple. And he wrote the foreword to this book. And Henry Giroux is an outright commie. He's not a particularly religious guy, right? Frady was a liberation theologian, a Catholic-ish communist posing as a Catholic, right? So here's what Giroux says about this. He says, as the reader will discover in this book, Frady is a harsh critic of the reactionary church. At the same time, he situates his faith and sense of hope in the God of history and of the oppressed, whose teachings make it impossible, in Frady's words, to reconcile Christian love with the exploitation of human beings. So there's your liberation theology for sure. Within the discourse of theologies of liberation, Frady fashions a powerful theoretical antidote to the cynicism and despair of many left radical critics. So Frady is their revivalist. Western Marxism was on the rocks, and now they have a revivalist. The utopian character of his analysis is concrete in its nature and appeal, and takes as its starting point collective actors in their various historical settings and the particularity of their problems and forms of oppression. It is utopian only in the sense that it refuses to surrender to the risks and dangers that face all challenges to dominant power structures. It is prophetic in that it views the kingdom of God as something to be created on earth, but only through a faith in both other human beings and the necessity of permanent struggle. The notion of faith that emerges in Frady's work is informed by the memory of the oppressed, the suffering that must not be allowed to continue, and the need to never forget that the prophetic vision is an ongoing process, a vital aspect of the very nature of human life. In short, by combining the discourses of critique and possibility, Frady joins history and theology in order to provide the theoretical basis for a radical pedagogy that combines hope, critical reflection, and collective struggle. Now let me just stress that this is in an education book titled The Politics of Education that was the education book that started transforming all of our colleges of education. And if you wonder if the woke education that has followed in the critical pedagogy mold is religious instruction, there's your answer. Our schools are teaching a heretical, crazy, theosophical faith that has managed to hide itself in math problems and Marxist gobbledygook so that people don't realize what it is. And of course, what does building the kingdom of God, thank you. What does building the kingdom of God here on earth mean in Marxist terms? It means being able to see what can be, unburdened by what has been. How do we do that? By completing man. Remember what Frady said? Because men are historical beings, incomplete and conscious of being incomplete, revolution is as natural and permanent a human dimension as is education. This is their religion, and it developed this way in the West. What is their religion? It is the satanic lie of returning to Eden, wholly on man's own terms, in absolute defiance of God. Everything else that we're talking about are just methods. But it's very Western. It's a you do you way back into Eden. So heaven in this religion, again, is the concrete alternative of Marcuse. It is a stateless, classless society. It's socialism that actually works and can somehow produce, with no social injustice, and of course a short working day and a very low standard of living. And even in reality, they can't get that right. They can't even make it work on a low standard of living. But by God, they're going to try, and that's what we're going to talk about after lunch. Thank you.